First, I would like to call upon our plenary speaker, Barbara Cyrus, who graduated from Free University Berlin as a vet and then also took her PhD there, and for some time now has been at the European Medicines Agency involved with licensing of medical products. And she's going to talk to us about regulatory aspects of new anthelmintic veterinary medicines, and perhaps that will be a framework for our discussion later on how we approach similar routes for alternative and complementary approaches. If I would invite you to share your screen, please, Barbara.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I think COMBAR is a really impressive cooperation of so many different disciplines, and I'm quite glad that the regulatories have also a little bit, hopefully, to contribute. What I would like to do here is now give you a little bit of a crash course in drug licensing, because quite a few of the studies that are ongoing might contribute to eventually getting maybe a medicine developed, and then focus on those bits that seem to be very novel and where just give you an overview where we are in this regard. So first of all, you heard that I work for the European Medicines Agency, which is the licensing body for veterinary and human medicines for those medicines that will be licensed all across Europe. I think you've all heard about the COVID vaccines, and they are the ones that will also be evaluated via the EMA. The EMA is now located in Amsterdam after about 20 years or more in London. And what we're mostly doing is coordinating the research and the scientific input across the member states. That little picture shows you the EMA. So it's half offices, half meeting rooms, because we do have a huge amount of committees. These are the main committees. The yellow one is the one responsible for veterinary use. And all of these committees are supported by working parties, expert groups. So it's a huge network of experts all across Europe we are dealing with here. Now, when it comes to the licensing, there are different routes how you can get a medicine on a market. The one we are dealing with here is what I'm representing is European, the centralized procedures. That means one application to the EMA, and eventually that will be medicine that is licensed or available all across Europe. But there are also national procedures possible, where only one or a couple of member states are involved. For you to know is that recently, well, last year, the veterinary regulation has changed, amended. It will come into force or into effect January 22. And a couple of areas have been changed here, namely antiparasitic resistance has a much higher impact now than it had before. There's some incentives to develop medicines that reduce or try to reduce the risk of development of resistance. But there are also some assessment issues that need to be considered. So all this legislation is published on the website of the European Commission. I put in here links if somebody's interested. What the EMA is doing is all the publishing scientific guidelines that can tell researchers how to do their tests in various areas. And not only in regard to European requirements, but we also do liaise closely with other regions. And these guidelines, they're called VICH guidelines, will also apply in other regions of the world, like the FDA, in America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Japan. So there are a couple of guidance documents that are not just European ones. We also publish the outcome of any medicine development, and this could be possibly of interest for you if you want to see how somebody else has done it, what sort of parameters have been used, and what did the authorities think about it? Is it enough or not? Now, what needs to be registered? And I've heard a lot of talks already today and yesterday about various bits. Obviously, what needs to be registered is a veterinary medicine. And what is linked to a medicine is what is called a maximum residue limit. And this is something that is only for veterinary medicines. On the human side, they don't have anything like this. I come to this a little bit later. There are also other products that need licensing, but they would not fall under the veterinary medicine legislation, although maybe the active substance is the same that is used. So you might have biocides, something like disinfectants or things that are used in the environment of an animal they would not fall under the VMP legislation, but under the European Chemicals Agency. Likewise, feed additives like coccidiostats, they are handled by the European Food Safety Agencies. Medicated feed is a European Commission remit. And then there is a whole range of products that have no clear European licensing requirements, but there might be member states level. So these could be the medical devices at something like syringes, bandages, but also all these test kits. I've heard a lot about test kits, so they would not be considered as a medicine, but it might have something that you might need to check with a member state, but they have a national rule on these ones. Diagnostic tests or nutraceuticals as well. There is a gray area, and there is not this would not be a medicinal product. So whenever you think about developing something, it is useful to check what it is you come up with to make sure that the requirements follow, the tests follow the requirements. Now, as I said already, a maximum residue limit is something that is necessary. And this is not something you can touch, it's just a figure, it's a number. And a value that is necessary for food producing animals, and gives you the maximum amount of a residue of a drug substance that is allowed in any food that is derived from a food producing animal, fish, milk, honey, eggs, and so on. Independent how you want to license your medicine, whether it's only a national procedure or the centralized one, the MRL applications need to go via the EMA. And any results will later be published in the European Commission's official journal or on our website. And the reason I'm mentioning it here now is that this can take quite a long time to develop. So if you develop something for use in, I don't know, fish, make sure the MRL is in existence. Otherwise, it adds up to a huge, big data set you might not have available very quickly. And how can you check that? Either the Commission's website or here, this is the EMA website. Unfortunately, the search, you have to search for medicine and then click veterinary and the EPA. So you find all these different results for a certain substance. And what you're looking for is a table like this. So that would give you the pharmacologically active substance, the animal species, and the target tissues, which are of importance. So if you think, oh, this is all fine, levomersol is sorted, you will see that this does not include fish. So you will have a problem here. If you want to have a fish medicine developed, you would need to find an MRL first. And likewise, the target tissues are important, because if there is no MRL for milk or eggs, honey, then you wouldn't be able to use this one. You will be able to use it in ovine, in cattle or in sheep, but not in those that you wouldn't be able to use the milk for human consumption. So this is some bit to consider. When it comes then to the medicinal product as such, you have to provide something called a dossier. And that dossier has 4 parts. Part 1 is all the administrative bits. Addresses, contact details, who is doing what, and this sort of administrative information. And the 3 parts where you actually need to provide data is the quality dossier, a safety, and an efficacy dossier. What we get is only data. We do not do any tests in the agencies. You've seen the photo before. This is just offices. So it's sometimes a misunderstanding. So the regulatory authorities only assess the data. We do not do any animal tests or laboratory studies. And when it comes to the decision on a medicine, this will be taken on a case-by-case basis. So each product will be judged on its own merit, on the risks and the benefits. And with the new veterinary legislation, as I said, this has recently changed. The risk anti-parasitic resistance is clearly mentioned in here as a risk that should be taken into account. So the pharmaceutical quality is something like a cookbook for medicine. So it tells you, you should provide information about where every little ingredient comes from, how it is put together, how it is mixed, where it is mixed, in what sort of container it is put, and so on, up to the labeling. Really, all the details, how the medicine has been developed, should be included here. And one thing, again, in red, I put it up. For certain manufacturing sites, we would need a GMP certification for veterinary use, and this can sometimes take quite a long time. So we had a couple of times smaller companies had problems getting these. They were not aware that how much time is needed to get the certification into place. It's something it is good to know that in advance. The quality requirements are very similar for human and for veterinary medicines. And for the safety dossier, up to a certain degree, it is the same. So for the safety, we would need to have data, usually laboratory data, good conditions, GLP conditions following OECD guidelines, either from new studies or from peer-reviewed literature. And this is general information about the pharmacology, the toxicology, mutagenicity, carcinogenicity. That's a sort of basic information that is needed. But specifically for veterinary products, you also need something that's called user safety, which basically addresses anything to do with humans. It can be the farmer who is mixing the medicine. It can be the veterinarian. It could also be your neighbor who's touching a dog that has just been treated with a spot on and is not aware of it. So that's a user safety assessment, and it's usually based on the most susceptible or vulnerable population, which is small children. The environmental safety assessment will need to see how the medicine or the residues, the metabolites of the medicine will fare in the environment. And that should then allow conclusions on for instance, warnings in regard to parasites, ectoparasites used on a dog. Can the dog go for a swim in a pond? Can the dung beetle still happily munch the leftovers, the feces of cattle grazing on a pasture? That's the sort of information the environmental safety assessment will give. And obviously for food producing animals, you will need to have withdrawal periods established for whatever food is produced by this animal. In regard to antimicrobials, you will also need to address the risk of the development of resistance in the human gut flora. Likewise, the efficacy dossier is also split into two parts. One, the preclinical part, requires as well pharmacology data, but these will be specified for the target species. And this includes pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics in the target animal, but also resistance data. So I flagged this up. This really is a requirement in Europe for companies to investigate the mechanism of action and to provide data. What we would ideally like to see is our recent data from various regions across Europe, and representative, of course, it is not always possible. And this is a resistance section applies to antibiotics and antiparasitics, and obviously antibiotics have more options available, but in principle this will be the same for the antiparasitics now. We do require tolerance studies, and these are usually overdose studies in healthy target animals, which will later on be necropsied, and the data will then be used to identify potential target organs. Obviously, this is not a study you can do in people, but because at the veterinary side it can be done, this will later on result in considerably smaller field studies on the veterinary side. So if you know already what target organ can be affected, that can be easier observed in the clinic later on. Dose finding studies will include artificially infected or infested animals with different levels that will then be treated or exposed to different levels of the medicine. And that should allow you then to develop the proper dose, the best dose with the least adverse events. You mentioned already in silico data earlier, and obviously all these preclinical and safety data, there are various incentives or possibilities to not do these tests in animals, but to have some replacement tests, calculations, and so on. And finally, the clinical part, the clinical studies, what we would like to see are here field trials in the target population. And with target population, we mean the age group, the breeds, the animals that are intended to be used in practice. and ideally a mix of different animal husbandry conditions that are representative for Europe, geographical locations. It will depend a little bit on what sort of medicine it is. If you use a heart medicine in pets, the conditions are pretty similar in the US, for instance, and in Europe. So you would accept data from America, but for field trials in terms of antiparasitics or anti-infectives, we would really want to see the EU data. I was asked to speak about the new medicines, but just in terms of the efficacy, once the medicine is licensed, we will have every medicine will have a very, very thorough monitoring. And the lack of efficacy is one aspect that veterinarians are asked to indicate for a medicine. This could be the reason for resistance development. And we do also always encourage veterinarians to let us know about these, because obviously the license will eventually end up based on the clinical studies that are submitted in the beginning here. Now, this is mostly for anthelmintics, what I've said so far, for pharmaceuticals. And for vaccines, we will have a similar approach in principle. So they would also need safety, quality, and efficacy data. The European monograph is a pharmacopoeia, also has certain monographs which vaccines might need to follow. But currently there is no specific EMA guideline available for any vaccines. The nearest we could find is something on coccidiosis, but this is not really an anthelmintic right now. There might be specific requirements if you speak about live organisms, or if the vaccine is manufactured using genetically modified organisms. There will be additional safety requirements in place. What usually is not necessary for vaccines is withdrawal periods, but it should be addressed in the dossier, and it might be that not the active substance is here of concern, but there might be some adjuvants or some excipients that could play a role. Having said that, it is recognized that it is a good alternative solution, but so far in Europe, we only have one medicine license, not centralized, but this is a national authorization. There are two others in Australia, South America, and South Africa, but they don't have a license, full license in Europe, as far as we could find out. The specific considerations here, and I would like to point out to this publication here from Edwin Clairbourn and Peter Geldhof. This is a brilliant overview on where we are right now, because we are not very far in regard to licensing, and there is like quite a bit of a problem or challenges in the vaccine development. We all know there are different life stages in parasites. They all have their own antigenic profile. The host-parasite interaction that mediates immunity is not fully understood yet. And then I think the manufacturing, the scaling up to commercial batch production is something that is also a problem. You probably all heard about the problems for the COVID vaccines to get the appropriate numbers of vaccines manufactured. And this will be exactly the same for veterinary vaccines. So the manufacturing at large scale is always a bit of an issue. The research focuses not on development of vaccines against the live parasites, but more the subunit, the recombinant subunit vaccines that will then be strengthened with an adjuvant. Myself, I'm not very familiar with vaccine development, I have to say, and a colleague of mine, Javier Pozo Gonzalez, helped me with the slides here. So I hope that the colleague, Edwin, that you can answer any question that comes up with vaccines, because this is not my area of knowledge. Now it comes to even more limited knowledge, which are the novel ones. Johannes had asked me to address the plant-based and nematode-placed products, and there is really nothing I could say to you, because there is nothing licensed yet. If it comes to plant-based medicines, the approach that could be taken is, it depends a little bit what the plant-based is. So if it's a herbal medicine, if it's something that is created by a mix of herbs or a single one, there are herbal medicines available on the human side, quite a lot of them. There are a lot of guidance documents available So in principle, the same principles would apply here as well. They would need to have a quality, a safety, and an efficacy profile, but the quality profile would need to follow the herbal guidelines. And in particular, if you will have a product for food producing animals, it might be challenging in terms for an MRL to be established beforehand. The nematode trapping is even more complicated because so far the veterinary legislation did not consider biologicals as such. This is different now with the new legislation. There is a new option now for a biological to be approved. And with colleagues, we discussed this issue, and the nearest we could come is to give you reassurance, yes, we could probably consider nematode trapping as a biological that could be licensed. There is a similar approach on the human side where leeches for are licensed for medical use, but in the absence of any clear guidance and experience with this one here, there is nothing published yet. And what we always encourage in those situations is seek early dialogue with licensing authorities. There is quite a lot of willingness on the side of the authorities to get into dialogue with applicants very early on. And I can only encourage you to approach authorities if there is an idea. Now, in summary, what we would recommend is check the websites of the EMA for scientific guidance that is already available. Also, you might need to approach, if you want to have national information for instance, for clinical trials, you will need to approach the countries where you want to conduct those trials. So there is a collection of contact details with the heads of agencies in the different member states. And the last big advice I would give to everybody who starts from scratch and is not a member of a big pharmaceutical company, work together with a veterinary consultant. It's really difficult to know all these details. It's a very complex field, and we would always recommend a consultant to contact. As an example, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the guidelines we develop here and just point out a few of the documents. We do have a good clinical practice, a GCP guideline, but also statistical principles. Statistics plays a big role, and this is something really to bear in mind. The target animal safety is mentioned here. And then it comes to anthelmintics. There are lots of anthelmintic guidelines developed at VSEH level. All of them are currently under revision. So we hope that a new revised documents will be available maybe next year. We don't know yet, but they have been under revision for a while, and we hope to finalize this revision eventually. What the EMA has also published is a reflection paper which reflects the current state of scientific approach in terms of resistance, which might be of interest for you. These are the different types of assistance you might come across. So in particular, the meetings with agencies or innovation task force, scientific advice, these are all approaches companies could choose early on to check with the authority how to get the license done. And finally, this is my final, it's not so much the regulatory aspect, but if somebody is very interested to see what regulators are doing, the EMA is also offering traineeships for recent graduates. And this is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope I stayed in time here, yes. So.
Thank you very much, Barbara. You're spot on time. We started a little late, and that's my fault and not yours, but we can program. I think it's a great opportunity really for the researchers in this group to speak to somebody across the other side of the desk. So we've had a lot of interest in Mentimeter, and the winning question is, will there in the future be a requirement for companies to provide assays or protocols or tools to test drug efficacy in the field post-registration of their new product?
If you go to this, there is something called summary of product characteristic for anthelmintics. We do have label recommendations, what goes into a package leaflet and so on. And it will be, of course, impossible to give a protocol for each individual situation. But in general, if you have a look in some of the recently authorized product, there's usually some prudent use warnings, and there is a focus that for instance, the disease should be established in the herd. How it is established is so specific, it is impossible to make it product specific. That's my personal view. There is certainly an incentive that it should not be used preventatively on a routine basis, but there should be some sort of prudent use considerations behind it. I don't know if that answers the question. It will be too detailed to have a specific approach in here. And if you have a clear, if this reflection paper gives quite a good overview on the different approaches that could be possible and the limitations the system will have.
Thank you. It's hard to know if that answers the question.
Yeah,
because it's not my question, but I guess once something is licensed, it's licensed, right? So if you then get resistance, it becomes less effective, but at no point do you then rescind the licensing?
What I tried to say before, so once medicine is licensed, there will be a monitoring in practice happening, and I don't know if you get veterinary records or these information on a national basis. Some of the licensing authorities publish recent findings. If they get a lot of adverse events reported, for instance, these adverse events will eventually be reflected in the package leaflet and the labeling and so on. And likewise, if there is a lack of efficacy, and if there is a real risk for resistance development, if there is clear indications for a risk, and this has been discussed, then yes, there is a possibility to change the labeling and the package leaflet. But it would be a separate procedure. And I think if you have a general look into anthelmintic licenses that are fairly new, you will find a lot of warnings in there, which in the olden days, 20, 25 years ago, when I first started working in the regulatory authorities, there was not much of warnings available.
Thank you. I can roll two questions into one next. There's a question on what aspects of environmental impacts do we have to consider in anthelmintics? And as part of that, is there an EMA requirement actually for environmental impact assessments for veterinary medicines?
Oh yeah.
So that during your talk.
This is not only a EMA one, it is a VICH guideline as well. All these VICH guidelines are on a more global level. It is part of the safety dossier. My background is efficacy, but where you find, if you go to the EMA website, you have the efficacy requirements and the safety requirements, and all the environmental risk assessment guidelines will be published here. So for VICH, for the ERA assessment, there are two phases. There's one approach that's usually used for pets, and another one is for food-producing animals. So it's very, very long explanations how the assessment is based, but it is something, there is guidance available, yes.
Thank you. And the final question is very specific and very popular. So how will the new regulation 2019/6 of the European Parliament on veterinary medicinal products address anthelmintic resistance?
How it addresses? Well, there are several parts where it is addressed. There is, for instance, as I said, there is the option. There are several places where it is addressed. How it is implemented then by the authorities is another one. The legislation is on a higher level than what is happening then in practical terms. And there are lots of committees and groups right now working on it still. All I can say is that the actual text of the legislation is done, it's published, and some areas, for instance, the prescription is something that is mentioned. The prescription for veterinary medicines for food-producing animals must be prescription only, and it can be moved from prescription only to non-prescription under certain conditions, and the antiparasitic resistance is one of those issues. The new legislation provides some incentives in terms of longer data protection for variations that reduce antiparasitic resistance, but details on how a company has to do it, these details are still being developed. So I don't know if that is clear enough, so I can rumble on here about the risks, but without knowing the details, it's difficult. We had a
No,
very
that's
challenging
fine.
year, and yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Barbara. We'll call time there if you could stop sharing your screen, please.
Yeah, sure.
And thank you. It's very informative and particularly useful. I think that you've included the links to further information in your presentation, and that'll be clear in the recording also. So much appreciated.
Yeah. If there are specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. My email address is in the presentations, but I understand this is limited here. So yeah. But anyway,
Marvelous,
thanks.
thank you.